My assumption and what I do is around 2 to 360 cycles per area 3 times a week at a frequency of Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. The last one marked the end of our evaluation, which concluded positive for BS, and today we will get into more practical aspects. So we're going to answer some questions that arise when you actually think about, how you are going to BS, right? So you can pretty much group the questions that would arise into 2 categories. One of them would be, right, what is our goal? What kind of growth are we trying to achieve? Why? It would regard facial anatomy, architecture of the bones. So we will have to look at the starting point, weaknesses, strengths, and then determine, right, what is our goal? What is the ideal pattern of growth that we would strive to achieve with BSing. So that is going to be individually dependent, but it is going to have some rules that are going to apply for everybody. Now, we are not going to get into that in this video. I will leave that topic for another one. Instead, in this video, we will talk about some more numerical aspects of the BS program. So it's going to regard variables that are changeable, such as, or pretty much, amplitude, so peak strain amplitude, frequency, volume, the number of hits, and strain rate, which is the speed at which the strain changes, obviously. So these are just like the 4 most simple variables that we can play with. There are also some more complex, I would not call them variables, but more principles, and those will be something like interpolation of intraday rest periods, monthly and weekly periodization, so taking blocks off and on. These are all things that have been studied, how they affect bone growth, and we will get into it, but these more complex variables or principles will be covered in future videos, as we will not have time for that in here. So I have mentioned that these variables have been studied in how they affect bone growth. Now why were they studied? Was BS studied? Well, obviously no. The principles of bone growth and how it changes in response to mechanical loading was studied in order to better understand osteoporosis and other bone conditions, and also out of pure scientific curiosity, as it is a quite interesting field, right? So if we dive into a lot of this osteology research, we'll find that these studies focus on mechanical loading, which is artificially inflicted upon, right? It is administered to an animal, as most of this would not be ethical to be done on humans. So it is administered on, let's say, simplified 2 groups of animals with only one variable being different. Let's say one group receives mechanical loading at a frequency of 1 Hz and another one at a frequency of 2 Hz. Then, if we sacrifice the animals, we can see what kind of differences each of the mechanical programs made, and then we can compare them. Now, how do we account for strain in these? Well, there's something called strain gauges, which are little chips that get implanted into the bone surgically, and you can literally measure strain that way. Although theoretically, if you apply the same force to a rat's ulna, for example, on average it is going to produce a same deformation if the rats were all raised in same conditions, right? It's a pretty similar, they have a ulna of a pretty similar strength. Now that is not really important. Now I have mentioned so the force is being applied on their bones. Now how is that done? Well, there are numerous ways, but 2 most common ones used in studies are 4-point bending as well as compression, so ulnar or tibial compression. So it is pretty simple. You can understand them without me explaining it. and then the force is being applied in a pulsatile manner. So it is stress and then relaxation, stress, relaxation, stress, relaxation. So it is applied in cycles, the same way that BS produces a force, which is quite interesting. And that is why I would say with a high degree of certainty that the principles by which these variables affect bone growth in these studies is going to translate literally into how changing of these variables in BSing would theoretically affect the bone growth that we will achieve. So if we sum up what I just said, we will in this video talk about 4 variables: amplitude, frequency, volume, and strain rate. Now, all of these variables have been researched in animals, how they affect bone growth in response to a mechanical program that applies a force in a pulsatile manner. That is literally how BS produces a force. Thus, the effect of these variables on the end result of a mechanical program, it is going to be the same between in BSing as it is in these studies. Alright, so let's now dive into the studies, or let's dive into the variables. Firstly, we will talk about amplitude. So, in the beginning, it was thought that bone response was not so linear as the strain increases. This thought was brought on by Harold Frost and his research. Although his contributions to the osteology are great and very significant, this is something that he got wrong in the beginning. That assumed relationship that he made was expressed via this graph. As you can see, the relation is quite literally not linear, and it is bound strongly via these boundaries of MSM, MSP, right? I have explained this graph more thoroughly in one of the other videos. I think it was 4. Anyways, so new research show the actual dependence that the adaptive response has with this variable to be more linear, resembling more this graph, and this is actually the current scientific consensus. So pretty much, the higher the typical peak strains a bone experiences, the more growth it experiences, and that relation was found by observing bone formation between animals administered loading regimens, eliciting different peak strain amplitudes, and keeping other variables constant, obviously. The same principle of research that I have explained earlier. So for example, this study had turkeys immobilized, thus isolating the effect only to the artificially administered loading regimen. So the ulnas were not able to be stimulated via their wing flapping or whatever they do on their everyday basis. And the only mechanical stimulus was the actual mechanical program that was artificially administered in the experiment. So, lasting 8 weeks of duration and consisting of everyday stimulus of 100 cycles at a frequency of 1 Hz, only differing in peak strains. The peak strains ranged from 0 to 400 microstrain, thus creating 8 groups, which can be seen on the graph. The researchers then mathematically calculated the average and plotted the line that resembles a linear function. Now, an interesting phenomenon also can be seen, that the higher the strain, the more individual dependence of the response that turkeys had. So the dispersion between the results of the last group is quite a bit higher than it is of the, let's say, the 1000 strain group. That would kind of indicate that the stronger the hits are, we would yield better results, right? The other aspect of this is that obviously there is a risk of injury. Pretty much 2 types of injury can happen. One would be a literal overstrain of a bone and a fracture after a few hits. You'd have to be really dumb for this. Like, don't do that. That is, I don't think I even have to mention that. But another type of injury that could happen, which can creep onto you in a way that you would not notice, is a stress fracture, which is pretty much an accumulation of micro damage and an inadequate amount given for bone to repair, which ends in a fracture, obviously. The reason why that is an issue here is that the accumulation of micro damage rises exponentially with the peak strain amplitude. Thus, going really hard is not really, I guess, worth it, right? You're increasing your micro damage accumulation exponentially, but you're only increasing results directly via this in a linear way. So I would recommend just being a little bit more patient, prolonging the program, doing it a little bit lighter, right? It should never hurt. It should never be uncomfortable, and thus, in the end of the day, you would get the same results. Maybe it will take a little bit longer, but it is far better than getting injured, because it can really fuck you up. It can cause asymmetries. It can cause, well, it will definitely cause time off, and at the end of the day, it is not going to give you faster results. I will have to make a separate video about this, but for now, this is all I have to say. Don't be dumb. Another variable that we could change to increase results would be frequency. Now, an interesting phenomenon here found is that the increase in bone formation related to strain amplitude is dependent on frequency, meaning the higher the frequency, the more sensitive is the increase in bone formation as amplitude rises, which can be seen on these graphs. Firstly, bone formation rises quite a bit faster in the group who received the same program with a higher frequency than in the group that received that program with the lower frequency. And on the right, you can see a graph showing a threshold for bone formation. So it is a peak strain amplitude above which the results, the bone formation happened, right? Below it, it was either zero difference or it was bone resorption. Clearly, the higher the frequency, the less that peak strain amplitude has to be. Talking about frequency, so let's now sum up everything we pretty much know about how frequency at which peak strain amplitude is applied at in a mechanical program affects the bone formation of that mechanical program. Generally, higher frequencies are associated with a more favorable adaptive response, even when adjusting for other variables, which is interesting. Studies have shown, for an example, that a mechanical load of 500 microstrains has little consequence if applied at 1 Hz, but is highly osteogenic if the frequency is increased between 10 and 60 Hz, which is pretty much the graph seen on the right. Now, unfortunately, BS gives us some practical limitations. We are limited by what we can physiologically do with our hand. In the beginning, it might be 1 to 2 Hz. An important thing here is to keep form very constant. That is the most important thing when playing around with frequency. You should not sacrifice form to do it faster. Every hit should look the same. It should be at an exact angle that you planned in before. It should be in the exact spot that you planned, and it should be same as the previous one and as the one applied on the opposite side of the face. With time, you will gain practice. You will get a little bit better at it. You might be able to BS at a frequency of 3 to 4 Hz, which is usually what I do. The rule here is to aim at the highest frequency possible without sacrificing form. Two tangents that I wanna talk about shortly is using tools to get an even higher frequency BS, like massage guns. I will talk about this in future videos, but it is quite promising. Another tangent that I wanted to throw in here is ultrasound frequencies that are being researched recently. I will talk about this in future videos, as I think it could be an area worth exploring. Moving over to the third variable, which is volume. And now what volume is basically, as I said, number of cycles. So daily volume would be the number of cycles totaled over the day per area, obviously. So here we have a study comparing volumes of 36 versus 216 versus 1200 cycles applied at a frequency of 0.5 Hz, administered 3 times a week for 2 weeks. Results showed bone formation reaches a plateau with the 216 to 1200 jump already providing a quite diminished improvement in the cortical surface. So if we look at the cortical surface of a bone, increasing the program from 216 2200 provided a quite diminished improvement, then jumping from 36 to 216. That improvement was noticed even earlier in trabecular bone at the jump from 36 to 216. Another study using an isolated avian ulna model compared effects on bone formation provided by increasing number of loading cycles in a given session of mechanical loading. Animals had their limbs immobilized and were divided into groups receiving either 4, 36, 316 and 1800 loading cycles at a 0.5 Hz frequency each day for 6 weeks. Results showed a quite diminished effect after increasing volume from 36 to 316. And a general consensus on this topic from numerous studies alike these is that the relationship between volume and bone formation resembles a saturating results graph, where the saturation occurs around that 2 to 400 cycle mark, at least on the cortical surface, which is more important for us. Thus, I would conclude that going above a volume of 2 to 300, maybe 350, 60 cycles is probably not worth it, as it still accumulates micro damage, but it does not provide any more bone formation. Moving over to the last variable that we have to discuss, it is going to be a quite quick one, which is strain rate, the speed at which strain changes. So the general scientific consensus here is that higher strain rates very much influence bone formation in a positive manner. So the higher the force is being applied at the bone and the higher the strain changes, the more stimulating that force and stress is. And it is believed that the relationship between strain rate and adaptive response is even more significant than that of peak amplitude or frequency with the adaptive response. We are lucky here that BSing inflicts a very efficient strain curve. I will plot these two things on the screen, and I will probably talk about this in a future video in more detail, so you can interpret research on this topic in a better way, and it is going to also relate to the topic of massage guns and stuff like that. I have to do a little bit more work on this, but pretty much the impact force that BSing inflicts provides a very fast change of strain because it is a hit, which means it is quite stimulating to bone, at least in theory, according to this research, right? So closing thoughts here are that I have to also note that not all of these variables were studied in all possible combinations, thus we must work with what we have. What I'm trying to say is that we do not have an enormous pool of research where all of these variables have been studied in literally every single combination. No, we have what we have. We can conclude general relations between how changing of these variables will affect the end outcome or bone adaptation, and then we have to interpret it and apply it for our BS program. Now obviously that requires us to use a little bit of this dubious extrapolating here, and it does leave us with a little bit of uncertainty, unfortunately, but I'm quite confident that this is how it works. And if obviously you have any suggestions, any ideas, I'm free for discussion. Summing it up, overall, although all of this is only my speculation, and I'm not your clinician, you're nothing literally, my assumption and what I do is around 2 to 360 cycles per area 3 times a week at a frequency of what I can efficiently do, which is around 3 to 4 Hz. As I said, if you have any ideas, suggestions, questions, wanna argue about this, right, there's comments, email, I'm active on the forum, so you can reach out to me any way you want. If you wanna work with me, want me to help you, you can also reach out to me through those means. And until next time, good luck.